media, tell the Prime Minister to go and get from Nelligan. We really enjoy doing this, head. Thank you very much.
Of course, that clip has gone around the world now. An exhausted fireman in Australia screaming obscenities at the country's Prime Minister Scott Morrison. He and many others accuse the PM of totally mishandling the country's worst fire in history. And you can see Mr. Morrison's approval ratings have plummeted during the crisis that's killed 30 people and an estimated 1 billion animals, threatening some with extinction. People are so angry they've even refused to shake his hand when he visits and have called him an idiot to his face. Does the Prime Minister really deserve all this abuse? And can he redeem himself? We're going to be asking our guests in just a moment. But first, a reminder of how we got here.
It's been labelled the worst fire season ever recorded, an apocalypse, and like looking into the gates of hell.
As bad as it gets, that is the stark warning from the Rural Fire Service.
It's something that's never happened to this degree. It was a firestorm.
Yeah, it was right here above. Look, it's that high. Bearing down on me. It was like the apocalypse, mate. It was like hell on earth.
We are being warned to brace for more deaths as the state's firestorm rages for a second day. The inferno has already claimed 2 lives. A number of homes, as you can see there, have been destroyed.
We will be declaring a state of emergency from 9 a.m. tomorrow.
Scientists say the gravity of the wildfires is directly linked to greenhouse gases making the planet warmer.
The government has dismissed new global rankings which show Australia is last when it comes to climate policy.
Do we need to act now?
Well, we are acting now. Australia's
do we need to do more?
Australia's emissions are 50 million tonnes on average lower every year under our government.
Firefighters are racing to save the wildlife amid those wildfires still raging. The staggering toll we've been reporting on here, now an estimated 1 billion animals lost.
Firefighters are exhausted and one cannot contain his anger.
You from the media, tell the Prime Minister to go and get from Nelligan.
Australians are angry at the Prime Minister because he was on vacation during a crisis.
He headed over to Hawaii with Jenny and his 2 daughters.
The PM announced his premature departure yesterday morning following the deaths of 2 firefighters in New South Wales. But 24 hours later, he was still there.
I know that has caused some great anxiety in Australia, and Jenny and I acknowledge that.
Happy New Year! As dozens of fires continue to burn across Australia, Sydney's New Year's Eve fireworks show went off as planned.
Just leave it a year and do it again next year.
Thousands of people have been forced to flee their homes. At least 18 people have died, including civilians and firefighters.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison copped some unfiltered criticism from locals in a town that lost everything.
Nah, you're an idiot, mate. You really are.
There's nothing quiet about these Australians.
Come back! You're not welcome!
That was Australia's Prime Minister there being chased out of Cobargo, one of the worst affected areas in New South Wales. Let's bring in our guest now. Top left there, we have Claire Armstrong. She's been on a few trips with the Prime Minister, not that one. She's a national political reporter with the Daily Telegraph and based in Canberra. We also have Evan Quatermain, a wildlife campaigner who just returned from Kangaroo Island with some really heartbreaking footage, which she'll be sharing with us in just a moment. And finally, the scientist behind the 1 billion figure we've all been hearing, Professor Chris Dickman of the University of Sydney. Claire, would you like to come to you for a quick update on the current situation? We've been seeing sort of hailstorms recently, but that doesn't mean the fires are over. Far from it, in fact.
No, one of the important things to grasp about Australia is that it's quite a large continent, and we did have hailstorms here in Canberra and across the southeast a couple of days ago, but that's not entirely where the fire grounds are. So as it stands, there's still about 70 odd fires in the state of New South Wales alone, which was the hardest hit over the Christmas New Year period. They're all contained at the moment, but there is actually a warning out as of today with temperatures of 40 degrees expected in some areas. So the risk is definitely far from over, though it is not to the extent that we saw a few weeks ago.
So, Professor Dickman, what is the threat to human and animal life now?
It's escalating again, I think, because of the, as Claire mentioned, the increase in the fire danger. It's going to be a very hot day in much of eastern Australia today, and even in areas where the rains have come and provided very welcome relief, it's going to be a tough time, I think, ahead for the firefighters. So humans, 28, 29 people have died already as a consequence of the fires, and hopefully that toll won't go any higher, but the conditions are worsening. And it's going to be a tough period ahead, I think, certainly for the people on the front line, and also again for wildlife.
Evan, you've just come back from Kangaroo Island, which is off the coast of South Australia, just across the water from Adelaide there. Tell us what you were doing there and what you saw.
Well, I was there rescuing animals, essentially. My CEO and myself, with one of our US disaster specialists, headed down to assess the situation, but as soon as we arrived, the devastation was evident, and we just hit the ground running, going through plantations and forests, bringing in injured and starving koalas, wallabies, kangaroos, possums, just doing all we could on the ground at the time.
We're actually playing some of your drone footage now. Just tell us what it shows.
Well, the drone footage shows the sheer scale of the devastation on Kangaroo Island. This is a massive tourist destination in Australia, one of our top 5 tourist destinations for international tourists in particular. And the fire has just devastated the western side of that island, with threats still ongoing.
And we have pictures of you here rescuing a koala. I think this was the last video you took before you felt, overwhelmed by the task and actually left the island. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so it just, no matter what we were doing on the island, it always seemed like there was more to do. We rarely got to our destination without having to complete a rescue. On that last day, I'd really hit a wall with my time there. I'd been going for 10 straight days with very little sleep, just running on pure adrenaline. I was heading back to base to book myself a flight out the next day, but of course I saw a koala on the side of the road, so I pulled over and it was very clearly injured. I could see an exposed rib. I could see that it was inflamed and in pain. It walked a few meters away from me, and then I was just able to slowly approach, scoop it up, and put it in the front seat next to me as I drove it back to the emergency vet clinic to sadly be euthanized. But it was a meaningful experience for me, and I'm really just glad that I crossed paths with that animal as I was leaving the island and was able to help one more creature out.
Let's get to the politics now. Claire, the Prime Minister's approval rating during this crisis has dropped around 8 points since August. What's he been doing wrong?
Well, at the start of this fire crisis, at the start of the escalation, I guess the most obvious thing that the world is probably familiar with is that he opted to go on holiday to Hawaii with his family. And not long after he had left Australia to do so, we had the first volunteer firefighter casualties of the season. 2 firefighters were killed when their truck rolled as they were battling the blazes. And that really escalated, I guess, the focus and the fears of Australians for just how dangerous the season was. And of course, the Prime Minister, who did say himself, and I don't think anyone disagrees, doesn't hold a hose to the flames. There was a desire to have some kind of national leadership during what was a really devastating time, days before Christmas, and he wasn't there. So since then, his response has, in a practical sense, just never quite been able to get over that initial problem that was perceived when he was overseas.
Yeah, and even when he came back, he was spotted on the beach at some point shortly afterwards. Professor Dickman, how do you feel about the Prime Minister's leadership during this crisis?
Yes, I think what Claire said is quite right, but a little bit of context perhaps is that all of this came about as a consequence of predictions that were being made by ecologists and environmental scientists really over the last 20 years or more. And so we knew that these sort of conditions would be happening at some time. But over the last 20 years or so, resourcing for any environmental monitoring has been just wound back. And I think it's just unfortunate that the current government has been in power at the time when everything has come to a head.
And we have, of course, in Prime Minister Scott Morrison, someone who likes to defend the coal industry, and he's been doing it for years. Here he is as Finance Minister, having a rather interesting prop in Parliament.
This is coal. Don't be afraid.
The
Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows the rule on crops.
It's coal.
Of course, under pressure recently, he does appear to be softening his stance just about. Let's have a listen.
Whether it was this season or last season, there was the view that we're living in longer, hotter, drier summers. This is obviously affected by the broader changes in climate. What I'm saying is we want to reduce emissions and do the best job we possibly can and get better and better and better at it. And I want to do that within a balanced policy which recognises Australia's broader national economic interests and social interests.
Professor Dickman, do you accept the Prime Minister's explanation? He does have to strike a balance between the economy and the environment.
That's true. But I think, on the other hand, the balance for a long time seems to have been struck very much in favour of, well, certainly away from the environment. And I think the symbolism of big decisions such as the green light for the Adani coal mine in Queensland, the recent decision to provide a green light for drilling by a Norwegian oil company on the Great Australian Bight are really sending the wrong signal. And at the same time, we're talking about, for example, planting lots of trees. That's a great idea, but for many years Australia has also been one of the world's leading land clearing nations, and the only developed nation to have land clearing on an industrial scale. So there are things that really have not been looking good for the environment. I think the balance really needs to be struck so that the environment is an effective part of the equation, and we haven't really seen that to any great extent so far.
Claire, across the country broadly, what is the mood towards climate change? Is the government doing enough, in most Australians' opinion, to tackle climate change?
If you'd asked me that a few months ago, I might have had a very different answer. Australia's political system has always been one that's quite transactional. If I do something, what do I get out of it? And to a lot of Australians, as late as September, October last year, the idea of paying more through some kind of emissions trading scheme that would push up their power bills, or having less because they need to have taxes directed toward environmental policies, would not have been a trade-off that they would have been willing to make. 2 months through the worst bushfire season than anyone can remember, there are a lot of Australians who now think, well, actually, there are some personal sacrifices that I'd be willing to make to have in exchange policies that combat the kinds of long-term climate impact like fires. So I would say there is a definite growing number of Australians who now look at the government's policy, which is currently in emissions reductions of 26 to 28% on 2005 emissions levels by 2030, and are asking if that's enough. But it's the very early stage of that shift in conversation, I would say, in the broader Australian public, beyond the sort of groups of people that have always consistently lobbied for more environmental action from the government, from any government, not just Mr. Morrison.
Now, in addition to his climate change policies, Scott Morrison's also been criticised for not giving enough federal money to support the voluntary firefighters who are risking their lives to help others.
Stand down now. You don't deserve to govern. You knew this was coming. It's been coming for a few years. You've been totally ignorant of it. And now we're wearing your problem.
Back to Evan now. Evan, just tell us about these men and women who are certainly seen as heroes across Australia.
They are heroes. Down on Kangaroo Island, what struck me straight away was how woefully unprepared the official response to these fires was. We saw the amazing fire service volunteers out there battling fires through the night. We saw locals driving around helping each other out. The community spirit was something that was inspirational, and I really think that, this, as Professor Dickman said just before, we've been woefully unprepared for this, and we've known it's coming for decades. So this is the wake-up call that Australia needed.
Now, clearly they do this willingly, and they feel duty-bound to do it. But when the Prime Minister says, well, they enjoy the work anyway, and then only very reluctantly and belatedly offered them $6,000 or up to $6,000 in compensation, and even that's going to be quite hard to get, I understand. How do they feel about him?
I think the news polls and his approval ratings speak for themselves in that regard. But this is so much bigger than our Prime Minister. It's about politics as a whole in Australia and how embedded it is with the fossil fuel industries. There's a real need for Australia to transition to renewable energy as soon as possible. But those people on the ground, I didn't hear a single complaint, to be perfectly honest. But to say that they enjoy what they're doing is just untrue. They were out there because they had to be. They were out there because they love each other and are working together. And they were out there just getting on with the job.
Claire, just tell us about the significance of this $2 billion fund that the Prime Minister has announced. Where is that going, and is that typical in this sort of circumstances?
Yeah, increasingly Australia is a place that unfortunately deals with a lot of natural disasters, fires, floods, cyclones, and it's become quite a common response from governments to establish a separate agency that administers money, in this case $2 billion, for the longer term response to the disaster. So with this $2 billion now, about $500 million is available this financial year, and that's being directed to mental health assistance for the people that have obviously been dealing with the devastation, mental health assistance. There's assistance for wildlife rescues such as Evans Group to try and do more to help the animals rebuild habitats and support them. There's support for small businesses, support for our agriculture industry. A lot of the area that burnt is where we have a lot of farmers who have lost a lot of their livestock and lost a lot of their infrastructure. But the $2 billion, in all honesty, the damage bill will end up being so much higher. We haven't even begun to actually count the cost, because in many cases the fires are still burning in some of these regions, and even though that direct immediate risk is reduced, there's no actual way to get in there and see just exactly what has been lost yet.
Yeah. You know, as we've sort of gathered, he's been criticised for being insincere and out of touch. Just watch this encounter with the locals in Cobargo once again.
Hello, how are you? I'm only shaking your hand if you give more funding to our RFS. So many people here have lost their homes. We need some beds. We need more help.
You'd be tired. Oh, really going to take that. Oh, well, it's nice to see you. Nice to see you too, mate. Okay, you want to... for a cuppa?
Claire, you've been on a few trips with the Prime Minister. He appears, from this particular clip, which has gone around the world, I'm afraid, to be rather inept. He doesn't seem to have the human touch. Is that always the case, or actually is this distorting it?
It's interesting. When he was on the campaign trail for the election last year, Mr. Morrison did sort of brand himself as a bit of a clumsy, awkward dad that'd have a beer and make a joke. And unfortunately, that persona just really has not translated in a lot of these scenarios where you're dealing with people who have lost everything that they own. In contrast, I have been out with the Prime Minister a few times, going to evacuation centres. On one particular occasion, it was about 3 days after he got back from his holiday in Hawaii, and an old couple rushed up to him to shake his hand and said, the woman said that she was very happy that he was here, but sorry that he'd had to cut his holiday short to do so, and she thought that everyone deserved a holiday at Christmas time. So it's obviously not the story everywhere, but I would say he has, since those couple of interactions we've seen, he's definitely adapted his approach to those communities, because it obviously wasn't working as we saw.
In the recent few years, we've seen quite a few Prime Ministers, and sometimes it's not the electorate that gets rid of them and gets a new one in, it's just the party itself. Do you think he can redeem himself, or will his own party push him out?
There's no risk at this stage that his party will push him out. He followed a long line of actually three prime ministers, 4 prime ministers, you could say, from his side in a short period of time, all removed by their own party. And it was widely expected that his coalition party would be completely kicked out at the election last year, but that wasn't the case. He actually delivered a somewhat miraculous return to power, and there's even though this issue is obviously caused a few dents, it's in no way risked his leadership particularly this early in an election cycle, Australia is not due to go to the ballot box again until 2021. So there's a lot you can do in that time to make up for that.
Now, in addition to the human lives lost, we've also seen hundreds of millions of animals killed by the fire. In fact, the most quoted number comes from our guest, Professor Dickman. He believes more than 1 billion animals have been killed across the country. Across Australia, more than 1 billion animals have felt the heat of the fires that have raged over this massive country, bigger than Europe, for months. They've now burned through 10 million hectares, almost the size of Bulgaria. Focusing on New South Wales, scientists estimate 800 million animals plus have been killed. That's just mammals, birds and reptiles, doesn't include insects. They base that number on a 2007 estimate that in each hectare, roughly a rugby pitch in size, you'll find just over 17 mammals, 20 birds and 129 reptiles. On the ecologically diverse Kangaroo Island of South Australia, it's estimated 25,000 koalas have been lost, half the total population. There are fears that other animals, including the glossy black cockatoo and the dunnart, have been pushed to the edge of extinction. It's just a microcosm of the kind of wildlife destruction that's believed to have taken place across the country, home to around 700,000 species. Back to Professor Dickman now. Professor, just tell us how much of an outlier, how unusual is this level of devastation in Australia?
It's unprecedented. I think the extent of the fires, the 10 million hectares of forest and woodland estate that have burned and burned so severely, really hasn't happened before. So the magnitude of the losses of animals, both in terms of individuals and the likely losses of numbers of species as well, we really haven't seen before. So this really is something out of the box, not entirely unexpected or unpredicted, because early climate change models were predicting these kinds of conditions with big fires. But nonetheless, this is the first time it's come about.
And Evan, we heard some animals have been pushed to the brink of extinction, and you saw that for yourself.
I did. The devastation on Kangaroo Island was just immense. The Kangaroo Island dunnart, its breeding colonies have just been completely wiped out. Sites where they were being monitored, I believe there's been 1 or 2 spotted since then, but for an animal that had less than 500 individuals in existence prior to these fires, this extinction crisis that Australia's been facing now for years and years, there's serious concerns about not just the dunnart, but a lot of insect life, a lot of microorganisms that we may not even know exists at this stage on Kangaroo Island.
And I understand you need to work with the government in one form or another. Do you feel that they are willing and able to take steps to prevent this happening again?
That hasn't been the indication in previous years. We're currently reviewing our national environment laws, and there's been a lot of rhetoric around the need to slash red or green tape to allow progress. But I think that hopefully this is a turning point for the government and for Australian politics in general, that we realise that we need strong national laws and we need resourced professionals out there understanding these places and protecting this unique nature that is found nowhere else on Earth.
Claire, is it politically necessary for the government to be seen to do something really quite significant now in order to get re-elected, or has Australia not quite reached that point yet?
I think it's going to be politically necessary for the government to do something, but we are a very wide-ranging country. We have a lot of communities who almost solely rely on employment and income derived through the minerals, the mining industry. There's as many people who fear that the environment is the biggest threat to life in Australia. There are as many that think that their job in their regional community is as important. So I think there won't be no result from this catastrophe in terms of the government response, but it's unlikely to be exactly what a lot of environmentalists and people have been looking for.
Professor Dickman, last question for you. What advice would you give to the government what would be the most important thing they now have to do to prevent a fire on this scale happening again?
Because these fires really have been unprecedented, I think it really will mean an all-of-community approach. Everybody will need to get together to try to understand what has happened, perhaps to identify those the factors that have contributed most to the fires, to look at the factors that have allowed some parts of the landscape to remain unburned, and to learn from that and to move forward with greater resourcing so that we can monitor the effects of our management interactions.
Professor Chris Dickman, Evan Quartermain and Claire Armstrong, thank you very much for your analysis today on the Nexus, and thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, you can see this and all our previous episodes on our YouTube channel. We'll be back next week. Till then, goodbye.